It being 2 p.m, we will move to question time. Is the Prime Minister seeking indulgence? Prime Minister?
Deal with ministerial arrangements.
Yes.
Of which there's quite a few today under the circumstances, Mr Speaker. I inform the House that the Minister for Home Affairs will be absent from question time. The Attorney-General will answer questions on his behalf and on behalf of the Minister for Defence. The Minister for Industry, Science and Technology will be absent today. The Minister for Health will answer questions on her behalf, and the Attorney-General will answer questions on behalf of the Minister for Employment, Skills, Small and Family Business. The Minister for Defence Industry will be absent from today. The Attorney-General will answer questions on her behalf. The Minister for Resources, Water and Northern Australia will be absent, and the Deputy Prime Minister will answer questions on his behalf. The Minister for Agriculture, Drought and Emergency Management will be absent for question time today. The Deputy Prime Minister will also answer questions on his behalf. The Minister for Immigration, Citizenship, Migrant Services and Multicultural Affairs will be absent for question time today. And the Acting Minister, who is also the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure, will answer questions on his behalf. The Minister for International Development, the Pacific and the Assistant Defence Minister will be absent today. The Minister for Veterans Affairs will answer questions on his behalf. And the Minister for Energy and Emissions Reduction will be absent, and the Treasurer will answer questions on his behalf. And finally, the Minister for Indigenous Australians will be absent from question time, and the Minister for Population, Cities and Urban Infrastructure will answer questions on his behalf.
I thank the Prime Minister. Questions without notice. The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My questions to the Prime Minister. Everyone in Parliament would agree that no Australian health worker should die due to a shortage of personal protective equipment. There are still reports that hospitals, GPs and pharmacies are struggling to cope with a shortage of personal protective equipment. Could the Prime Minister please update the House on when these shortages will be fixed?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, I thank the Shadow Minister for Health for his question, and I'll ask the Minister for Health to provide a more detailed response. This has been one of the key focuses of the government now over some period of time, and we've been able to secure significant supplies, particularly in recent days and weeks, and I want to thank all of those who have been involved, whether from industry or government directly, in securing those supplies from a large many sources. We've also been working now over many weeks to increase our own domestic production capability of that same equipment. It is important for all the reasons that the member has said, and I'll ask the Minister for Health to further update the House.
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to acknowledge the member for McMahon for his question. One of the highest priorities of this government has been to ensure continued supply of personal protective equipment in what has been an intensely competitive global environment. We've seen the shortages and the suffering not just of health workers but in relation to the broader population, whether it's in Europe or North America, whether it's in parts of Asia or elsewhere. Against that background, we've been determined to continue through both domestic production and international procurement the supplies of personal protective equipment. That's included the distribution of 11 million masks to date, which includes 2.5 million to primary healthcare networks to support GPs, community pharmacies and Aboriginal and community-controlled health organisations, more than 1 million masks to support those who are assisting in frontline activities, and then 6 million masks to state and territory health departments to support the acute care sector, in particular hospitals. We have also, as part of our procurement program, now landed over 30 million masks in Australia. This has been a difficult and challenging task. That is part of a broader order process of 500 million masks. As a consequence, we are now allocating a second round of 11 million masks, and shortly before question time I announced that that would include 7 million for states and territories for their frontline public hospitals, 2.3 million to primary health networks, including 1.5 million for GPs, 500,000 for community pharmacies, 75,000 for Indigenous workforce and healthcare, and 160,000 for respiratory clinics, and 1.7 million masks for our aged care workers. So we'll continue to provide those masks. We are now getting ahead of the curve on this front, but we are very mindful of international supply constraints, and I want to thank our healthcare workers. They are literally saving lives and protecting lives, and we will do everything we can to support them and to protect them.
And I call the member for Bass.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Australians are stepping up in response to the coronavirus by following health advice and social distancing measures that protect themselves and their fellow citizens. How is the Morrison government working to ensure it can continue to protect the lives and livelihoods of our fellow Australians throughout this pandemic?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Bass for her question and her leadership in her community during these crises that we face, as well as acknowledging all members in this House for the strong leadership they're showing it in their local communities at this difficult time. Over the past 11 weeks since we first declared the coronavirus as a disease of pandemic potential, we have been putting in place the key protections and supports that will be necessary for Australia to combat the virus and to combat and withstand and cushion the significant impact that will flow as a result of the economic consequences of the virus. We have navigated our way together through these early stages and set up a national baseline of these supports right across the country. That has been done not just through the actions of the federal government, of course, but through the strong coordinated leadership that has been exhibited through the National Cabinet and the Premiers and Chief Ministers and all of their state and territory governments. We now have in place one of the strongest testing regimes of any country in the world. We have been flattening the curve, reducing the rate of daily growth from over 20% to what is now an average around 2%. We are boosting the ICU capacity and getting access to those critical supplies that the member for McMahon was just asking about. That ICU capacity we will see treble. And the time that we have bought in the way we have flattened the curve with the measures we put in place, particularly when it comes to social distancing and other restrictions in the community that has been accepted and adapted to by the Australian community, has been nothing short of phenomenal, and we thank them for their cooperation. Federally, whether it's been the private hospital guarantee, the work we've done on accessing respirators and testing facilities and engaging with other countries. I was only speaking to the President of Korea yesterday about these issues and the Secretary of State this morning from the United States. The telehealth facilities, the aged care workforce, the search for a vaccine, the mental health support, some $6.3 billion worth of health-related measures, protecting the vulnerable, whether it's the $123 million to support Indigenous communities, the $200 million for emergency relief, the support for delivering meals to the elderly, $150 million for domestic violence initiatives, particularly through programs such as 1-800 Respect, cyber security and e-safety supports, because we have so many more Australians, particularly children online, who are vulnerable, support through our disability services, and of course the economic lifeline that is being provided through doubling of the job seeker arrangements with the supplement, the $130 billion JobKeeper program, the mandatory code to support tenants through their leases, the childcare arrangements which are free to Australians who particularly need it. This is all buying us valuable time, time that will enable us to work through this crisis to the other side and beyond.
And I call the member for Dobell.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Health Minister has said expert medical advice is that everyone aged over 6 months should be vaccinated against the flu. Does Australia have enough flu vaccine for all Australians aged over 6 months, and how is it to be provided to Australians, including vulnerable Australians?
The Minister for Health.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Dobell and acknowledge her work as a pharmacist over the course of her career. A flu vaccine is a very important thing. I have just stood up with both Professor Michael Kidd, the Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Primary Care, and with Dr Tony Bartoni, who is the President of the Australian Medical Association. Dr Bartoni urged as many Australians as possible to have the flu vaccine. On all of our current projections, we are going to meet all of the demand. In particular, on the National Immunisation Program, we have 8.5 million flu vaccinations, which includes those between 6 months and 5 years of age, those with certain comorbidities, Indigenous Australians over the age of 50, and in particular older Australians beyond 65. The advice that I have is that we have sufficient national immunisation program and other supplies in Australia. I think that we are seeing a very good take-up, but out of an abundance of caution, we have also spoken with suppliers, and indeed I have spoken with the global CEO of CSL within the last 48 hours, and I am very confident that CSL, which is a great Australian company, will provide additional supplies. They're currently assessing that. That is likely to ensure that not only do we meet our demand, but we have spare capacity to ensure that everybody who seeks support for flu vaccination through the Australian National Immunisation Program or through the private market will have that support met.
And I call the member for Boothby.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Would the Treasurer update the House on the latest measures the Morrison government is taking to help workers stay connected to their employers and to keep people in jobs while the coronavirus crisis continues to unfold? Treasurer, isn't this further proof that we will do what it takes to ensure that Australia bounces back stronger?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question and acknowledge her deep commitment to ensuring that her constituents get as much support as they need during this very difficult time for them and for the nation. Mr Speaker, today is one of the most important days in the history of this parliament. Today, we reach across the political divide to pass legislation that will save millions of Australian jobs. Mr Speaker, today, the People's House, will deliver for the people of Australia. And the JobKeeper payment is an economic lifeline for millions of Australians. It's a game changer. A $1,500 flat payment paid every fortnight to those who are eligible is equivalent to around 70% of the median wage. And in those sectors that have been hardest hit by the coronavirus, namely retail, hospitality, tourism, in many cases it can be around 100% of the median wage. Mr Speaker, this package is costed at $130 billion, the most significant package that has been brought to this parliament to support Australian jobs. Those who are eligible are part-time workers, are full-time workers, are casuals who have been with the employer for 12 months or more, are sole traders, and are those who are working for the not-for-profit sector, Mr Speaker. I can inform the House that as of 10 a.m. this morning, more than 730,000 businesses had registered their interest in the JobKeeper program on the ATO website. And for those employees and employers who are looking for more information, treasury.gov.au, Mr Speaker. There are around 6 million Australian workers that we believe will be able to access this scheme and provide a very significant economic lifeline to them at this very difficult time. But what's most significant about the JobKeeper program is that it will maintain that formal connection between the employer and the employee. It will make it easier for Australians to stay in a job and for businesses to keep them in a job. And we're very focused on the recovery phase, and the JobKeeper program will help the Australian economy bounce back stronger than ever.
And I call the Deputy Leader of the Opposition.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. On 15 March, the Prime Minister banned cruise ships from docking in Australia, with arrangements, and I quote, directly under the command of the Australian Border Force. 4 days later, the Ruby Princess docked in Sydney. Given Australian Border Force is responsible for protecting Australia's borders and had direct command of those arrangements, does the Prime Minister take any responsibility for the Ruby Princess fiasco?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The member would be very well aware of the statement that was made by the ABF Commissioner, Michael Outram, on this matter on the 25th of March 2020, which set out very clearly the actions and responsibility of the Australian Border Force in relation to that matter, and I table that statement for the purposes of the House and for the information of the member, and I think that addresses his question specifically and completely.
And I call the member for Indi.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. In recent days, I've been flooded with concerns from childcare providers worried that they will lose significant revenues as a result of the recently announced changes to childcare funding. Can the Minister guarantee that no childcare provider, including those run by councils, schools or in-home care, will be worse off under the new funding arrangements?
The Minister for Education. Minister.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Indi for her question. And as she would know, we're backing free early childhood education and care for around 1 million families, no matter what type of service they use. Now, this has been an incredibly significant change, which was brought about because there was overwhelming feedback from the sector of the potential for a large number of services to collapse. So therefore, in the space of 7 to 10 days, we overhauled the childcare sector to put a fundamental underlying some security into the sector. Now, what this change means that the new payment, which is 50% of the revenue that services received up to the hourly cap in the fortnight before the 2nd of March, providers will be paid that weekly, and it will be calibrated with the JobKeeper payment. Now, for all services out there who want to get further information about their eligibility for the JobKeeper payment, we have set up the Childcare Subsidy Help Desk. Those providers can dial 1300 667 276, and I'll repeat that, 1300 667 276, to find out about their eligibility, how they apply for JobKeeper, and how that, which will provide over $1 billion or approximately $1 billion to the sector, that coupled with the $1.6 billion that we are putting into the sector with this new payment, this underlying payment, how that will enable their viability to continue. There is also another mechanism for providers where there might be extenuating circumstances where they need further assistance. So there will be a special circumstances payment which will also be set up, and that will go live on the Department of Education's website tomorrow. So for all those services, some, for instance, might operate for 24 hours. So we'll have to take those circumstances into account, and there might be, for instance, some providers who look after children with special needs who are accessing a large proportion of the additional childcare subsidy. In those instances also there will be additional arrangements which will be put in place. Can I just take the time to thank all those in the sector and also all the officials who worked with the government to design this new system of providing free childcare for especially all those workers on the front line who over the next 6 months will be helping us defeat this pandemic.
I call the member for Reid.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer outline to the House the economic support the Morrison government is providing to support Australian jobs, businesses and households while the coronavirus pandemic unfolds?
The Treasurer has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I thank the member for Reid for her question, acknowledge her background in small business, her time as a practising psychologist and her commitment to serving her constituents. Mr Speaker, Australia has approached the global pandemic with the coronavirus from a position of economic strength. We have got the books back in order by delivering the first balanced budget in 11 years. Mr Speaker, this has given us the financial firepower to respond with these unprecedented measures that we have announced. But we've stuck to our principles in relation to all the measures that we've announced. There have been principles are ensuring that our measures are targeted, they are proportionate, they are temporary and they are scalable, Mr Speaker. We've announced 3 separate packages. The first package was a stimulus package at $17.6 billion with accelerated depreciation allowances, instant asset write-off, $750 payments to 6.5 million Australians. And I can inform the House that some 6 million payments have been already made, totalling around $4.5 billion, making its way to pensioners, to carers, to those on other income support. We announced a $1 billion relief recovery fund, and we announced a significant cash flow boost for small businesses. The second package, Mr Speaker, on the 22nd of March at $66 billion was different in both scale and scope and involved an effective doubling of the safety net with our $550 coronavirus job seeker supplement, Mr Speaker. Another $750 payment, changes to the deeming rates, to the drawdown rates, giving people early access to their superannuation, as well as strengthening further the cash flow boost for small business, as well as changes to the insolvency and bankruptcy laws to provide a regulatory shield. On top of that, we now have our $130 billion JobKeeper package. But, Mr Speaker, I'm pleased to inform the House that today Standard & Poor's reaffirmed Australia's AAA credit rating. And in doing so, they said, and I quote, "Australia's strong fiscal performance remains a credit strength," and that the measures that the Morrison government have put in place, and this is their words, won't structurally weaken Australia's financial position, Mr Speaker. A very significant endorsement of the necessary measures that we've had to take, the unprecedented measures that we've had to take, but those measures have been designed to keep Australians in jobs and Australian businesses in business.
Well done. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Prime Minister. Given the JobKeeper wage subsidy is being supported by both sides of this chamber to maintain the relationship between employees and employers, will the Prime Minister extend the wage subsidy for the 1.1 million casual workers who are currently excluded?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The package of measures that we announced before the JobKeeper program was for the Job Seeker program. The Job Seeker program ensured that through the Job Seeker supplement, the COVID supplement, we were doubling the level of job seeker support to Australians who found themselves in a situation where they are no longer in work. Those arrangements were the first layer we put down to ensure that our social security net was strengthened and expanded to ensure that it could capture more and more Australians who found themselves the victims of the economic crisis that has hit Australia as a result of the coronavirus. Now, in addition to people who are eligible for those payments, they don't only just receive the job seeker payment and the supplement for the coronavirus, they also are able to get access to a range of other social security supports, whether that's rental assistance or family tax benefit, Part B and a range of other measures that can support people through these situations. Now, it would be a mistake.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, yes. A point of order on relevance. The question was very specific. It went to the relationship between employees and employers being maintained. That's at the heart of the government scheme. What the Prime Minister is talking about is once that's severed and people are unemployed. That's what we're trying to avoid here.
I understand that the Leader of the Opposition is trying to explain his question. The Prime Minister is being relevant to the question that was asked. The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. As I was just about to remark, we put the job seeker payment and its increased capacity in place because we knew there would be those who would not be ultimately eligible for other measures we may consider. And what we have done with JobKeeper is we've ensured we've extended to casual employees for those who have been with their employer for 12 months or more, a status that is already recognised under Australia's taxation system. And so in putting together the $130 billion package, that is where we ultimately drew the line, because, Mr Speaker, when you're putting these lifelines in place, you have to draw lines somewhere. And when we drew that line, we knew we could do it, knowing full well that we had already acted to put the job seeker safety net in place for those who wouldn't be eligible under the JobKeeper program. So we have put our arms wide out as a government and as a country to support those who have been impacted by the devastating effects of the coronavirus in our economy. The Job Seeker program and the JobKeeper program work together. They work together to provide the foundational supports in our economy and in our community to ensure that we can help Australians get through these crises. And so that was the reasoning behind our decision, Mr Speaker, and we will continue to ensure that that support is in place. But as I've said on a number of occasions, it is so important we find our way through and out, because these lifelines cannot be in place indefinitely. And that is why we are working on the health issues to ensure that we can get back to a position as quickly as we can, and subject to the health advice, to ensure we can get our economy moving again.
The member for Nichols.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister, Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development. Will the Deputy Prime Minister inform the House how the Morrison-McCormack government is ensuring regional Australia essential operations continue to function during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the Congupna Kid for his question. I say Congupna Kid, Mr Speaker, because back in the 1980s, when he was recruited by Geelong, he came from that little town of Congupna to play at the game's highest level, the Victorian Football League. And back then, it was a different era than it is now, and he played more than 60 games for Geelong, for the Cats. I hear the Deputy Leader of the Labor Party say he's a great Geelong supporter. And he played in an era when it was one in, all in. The coach would get the team before the game and he'd say, when the fight's on today, it's one in, all in. And we are up for now the fight of our lives, and it is one in, all in. For every single Australian, it is one in, all in, because we are all in this together. And, Mr Speaker, it is a fight we will win. We will win it together. We will win using the same axiom that coaches used in the 1980s in the VFL. Mr Speaker, we need to exercise all of those hygienic hand-washing exercises, social distancing. Mr Speaker, there are many heroes at the moment, truckies, farmers, Mr Speaker, even sign language experts. The one standing beside Mark McGowan the other day, I have to give her a shout out. How good was she? And how good are the sign language experts? Never have we relied on them so much, so often, Mr Speaker. But of course we've got those frontline health professionals, whether they're in rural and remote Australia, whether they're in capital cities, wherever they are, we thank those doctors, nurses, pharmacists, no matter what they're doing, cleaners, we thank them and we rely on them, and we'll go on doing that. One in, all in. Mr Speaker, there is no shortage of food for families in Australia. I want to assure the House that food security is what it should be. Our farmers, those fantastic heroes of rural and regional Australia, grow food enough to feed 75 million Australians and others besides, 3 times our population, 75 million people they feed every year. One of the challenges has been finding, of course, consistency to ensure that we have ease of access across some of those borders which have been closed. And I thank my state and colleagues and territory colleagues as far as transport and infrastructure is concerned. Mr Speaker, we have been meeting on a bi-weekly basis via teleconference and daily by phone, and never have I got on so well with so many Labor state ministers, Mr Speaker. We've also, of course, announced the $1 billion Relief and Recovery Fund, and an additional $100 million to provide direct financial support to smaller regional airlines, $198 million to subsidise those routes into the 138 or so regional centres which rely on aviation to take vital medical personnel, medicines and all the rest to those important centres.
The member for Rankin has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Can the Treasurer confirm that under the government's legislation he will have the power to extend the JobKeeper wage subsidy to casuals employed for less than a year, local government workers, university staff and teachers, temporary workers, disability workers, arts and entertainment workers and workers employed by charities that have experienced a drop in donations alone?
The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, I can confirm there is a power in the legislation for the Minister to make changes to the system, but I can also confirm to the Chamber, to the House, that National Cabinet agreed that local government was the responsibility of state governments. In terms of casuals, as the Prime Minister has already told the House, casuals who've been with their employer for 12 months or more are eligible for the JobKeeper payment. Mr Speaker, this is a $130 billion program. This is a very substantial program, and indeed a program like none other. It's different to the United Kingdom's program, it's different to New Zealand's program, it's different to Canada's program. It's an Australian solution to an Australian challenge. And under this program, some 6 million Australian workers will be eligible and benefit, is the expectation. And Mr Speaker, part-time workers, full-time workers, casuals, sole traders, the not-for-profit sector will all benefit from this very significant wage subsidy, which will help this country and the millions of Australian employees who use this program to get to the other side after the coronavirus crisis.
The member for Ford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations. Will the Attorney update the House on how the Morrison government is protecting Australians by making important but temporary changes to our industrial relations system to ensure millions of Australians have access to the $130 billion JobKeeper payment?
The Attorney-General and Minister for Industrial Relations.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for his question. And as the member points out, the changes are temporary, but they are also substantial, critical and very important. And the changes that are being made to the Fair Work Act are being made to make certain that it is possible for the $1,500 job seeker payment to be made and to maximise the effect of the $1,500 job seeker payments, of course, of which there will be $130 billion worth. They're changes that will only apply to employees and employers who are eligible for and receive the payment, and they will only apply for the 6 months that the system remains in effect. These are absolutely necessary given the nature of Section 45 of the Fair Work Act and the construction of awards and enterprise agreements to make sure that the $1,500 payments, when they are applied without further wages, to actually be able to be applied. Without these changes, that would not be possible. And the changes that go to issues such as employees' duties and location will also have the effect of maximising the effectiveness of the $1,500 payments. Again, they are temporary, so they will cease to operate these changes in September 2020. I want to thank the ACTU and employer organisations for helping in the design features of some of the matters that are being addressed in the Fair Work Act. The central change is what in the Act is called a JobKeeper enabling stand-down direction. That will facilitate an employer reducing by direction the number of hours that an employee would work, according to this very important test, where the employee cannot be usefully employed because of changes to their business attributed to COVID-19 pandemic or government initiatives to slow the transmission of the virus. So the ultimate safeguard here is that the Fair Work Commission will be able to determine whether that very well-known test, whether an employee cannot be usefully employed because of changes to the business, the relevant business, the Fair Work Commission will adjudicate as to whether or not that test has been met. That critical change makes the system work. Also critical is the fact that all members will be aware the employer must pay the greater of the $1,500 JobKeeper payment or the lawful amount owing to the employee in accordance with their normal hourly rate, including applicable penalties and overtime. But the changes in flexibility around things like duties and location could mean, for instance, that where a cafe owner is now only able to serve coffees and is not serving food anymore, that they can work with the chef and direct the chef, subject to the safeguards of the Fair Work Commission, to take coffees to customers, even though that's not what the chef usually did. And something like that can keep a business afloat. I just noticed finally that the Business Council of Australia noted that those flexibilities about duties and locations won't apply to people who aren't in the system, but there is still the ability to change the awards, and that is a process that's been cooperative and should be ongoing.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Why will the government allow business to double-dip by receiving the JobKeeper wage subsidy at the same time that they are running down their employees' annual leave at the full rate, as though the subsidy was not being paid?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Mr Speaker, as the member I suspect knows that no person under these arrangements who takes leave would take leave otherwise by agreement with their employer. So it would be by agreement between the employer and the employee if they took leave, and that would enable that employee to be able to get the full value of their leave paid at their actual wage rate for that entire time, and that would enable the employer to support them in doing that through this arrangement. Mr Speaker, that is good news for the employee. It's in good news for the employer, and it enables both of them to work together on an agreement that they consider in both of their best interests. That's what we're asking Australians to do, to work together to find the right outcome with the supports and arrangements we've put in place. It's no different to what we're asking through the National Cabinet and state legislation, what we're asking landlords and tenants to do. These are not usual times, and they will require unusual arrangements. But what we're providing for here is these unusual arrangements by agreement, and in these cases it would be by agreement between the employer and the employee.
The member for Higgins.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update the House on steps the Morrison government is taking to support Australia's hospital network in response to the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Health has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for Higgins, not just for her question, but obviously for her service throughout her career as a leading Australian medical professional, paediatrician and researcher. One of our great challenges as we address the coronavirus in Australia is to ensure that we have the capacity within our system for all possible eventualities. It's part of a grand national approach, a strategic approach where we're seeking to contain the virus and increase our capacity. As we saw from the modelling yesterday, we could have faced a situation of between 3 and 20 million people who could have had the virus. We are not facing that now, thank goodness. And that, from the outset, set the two great tasks of containing the virus, which we are doing increasingly, but we have a long way to go. I really want to emphasise that. There are some who, with the best of will, would say things are looking good, now we can just release. That's not the case. We have a long, long way to go. But as that curve has flattened, we've also been building the capacity of the system. Primary care, aged care and our hospital system. One of the most important parts of that has been the partnership between the public hospital system and the private hospital system into a single integrated national network. That partnership means that we've been able to bring an additional 30,000 beds and beyond into the fight against coronavirus in an integrated approach. It means that 57,000 nurses and 105,000 hospital workers all up are being brought into that battle. And importantly, it means the retention of those jobs through the coronavirus fight and beyond. It means the capacity of that system will be available now, but will also be there as we emerge. And that, I think, is an immensely important position for Australians, because that capacity will be there to deal with all of the other health needs that as a nation we know so well, be they cardiac or cancer, be they orthopaedic or otherwise. So this partnership is exceptionally important. What it also does is it means that the private sector will work in with the public sector. As a government, we've given a guarantee that we will cover everything beyond the state partnerships with the private sector, that we will also meet 50% of those partnerships. All of this is about the Federation working within the National Cabinet that the Prime Minister and the Premiers have designed, and about saving lives and protecting lives.
The member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. On Sunday, the Treasurer said that all registered charities would be eligible for the JobKeeper wage subsidy if they had a decline in turnover of 15% or more. But less than 24 hours later, the government reversed that position and said that schools and universities would be excluded. Why?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, Mr Speaker, universities and non-government schools, to help the honourable member, are being treated like other not-for-profits. They are eligible for the JobKeeper payment. However, those with an annual turnover, and this would obviously be relevant to universities, not to non-government schools, of more than $1 billion, will need to meet the turnover threshold of 50%, and those with an annual turnover of less than $1 billion will need to meet the turnover threshold of 30%. But charities other than universities and the non-government schools that are registered with the national regulator will be eligible for the JobKeeper payment if they have suffered a decline in turnover of 15%. Mr Speaker, this reflects that at this particular time there is going to be a significant increase in the demand for such services.
The member for Lindsay.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is increasing resources available for combating the scourge of domestic violence, particularly during the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for the Environment, representing the Minister for Women.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and can I thank my friend and colleague, the member for Lindsay, and note her leadership in her community of Western Sydney, not just with the coronavirus pandemic but also throughout the bushfires, where I met with her community earlier this year. Thank you for the question. Mr Speaker, unfortunately, while for many people working from home is tedious, annoying, frustrating, and we see the anecdotes often on social media, for many, particularly women, it is not a safe place to be at home. And the increasing concerns around financial security, being in an enclosed environment, perhaps with a perpetrator of domestic violence, and all of the associated challenges and the difficulty of being able to access the services you need, it all creates a unique and a pressure that has been very important for this government to recognise. Now, we have made the biggest ever Commonwealth investment, $340 million, in the national plan, the fourth action plan for the national plan to reduce violence against women and their children. But we have now added $150 million. My colleagues in the other place, the Minister for Social Services and the Minister for Women, have led the COAG Women's Safety Group and provided immediately $32.5 million to the states and territories to provide the services that they need. And while that happens, a further $97.5 million will be allocated as we all work together to see what is needed. Services do need to be able to continue to support those in need over the next 6 months. Emergency and crisis accommodation, counselling and outreach, men's behavioural change, responding to the unique challenges of rural and regional women. All of these things matter. And what I want to say, Mr Speaker, is that while you may feel isolated in your home, and indeed we understand that, the services are there. The help is there. You must ask for help, and it may be via telephone, it may be via web, it may be via 1800 RESPECT. But all governments are there to support women, indeed all victims of domestic violence in these challenging circumstances. The National Information Campaign was part of our funding, and that again will encourage people to go to the right place, to reach out for help. With the supports that we've enacted, the Treasurer has talked about the JobKeeper program, because financial independence adds to women's security. The Minister for Education has talked about access to schools, access to free childcare. All of this supports women in challenging situations. All of this adds to the package and the determination of this government to make sure that during the challenging months ahead, no one is left behind.
The member for Ballarat.
Thank you. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister. Is the government confident that all domestic airlines in Australia will survive the COVID-19 crisis without further support?
The Deputy Prime Minister has the call.
I thank the member for Ballarat and Shadow Minister for Infrastructure, Transport and Regional Development for her question, and we are doing everything that we can to get every regional airline through. And that is why, on March 18, when I stood at the Wagga Wagga Airport and announced the initial $715 million package, that benefited not only the big players in the industry, Virgin and Qantas, but also regional airlines. And what we did was we backdated those announcements affecting fuel excise, affecting Air Services Australia fees and affecting such things as security screening, and that provided $159 million at that point, because of the backdating, straight in to those companies' bottom lines. And what we then did as we announced our $298 million package for regional aviation. And so $198 million of that is going to those regional air services for the 138 or so centres that rely on sometimes a daily, sometimes a weekly, but vital air services to provide, in the interim, going forward, maybe a service a week to provide medical personnel, medicine, indeed medical supplies to those centres right across Australia, 138 or so of them, and all of those airlines, be it Regional Express, be it Qantas Link, be it Virgin, can access that $198 million of subsidy for that particular service. And of course then, on the same day, I announced $100 million of underwriting for regional airlines. And we want regional airlines to come through the other side. It's one in, all in. We want to make sure that regional aviation, all aviation, can be its best self out the other side. That's why the federal government is providing and has provided more than $1 billion of support for aviation. We want our airlines to come through the other side. We realise it's going to be very, very tough for them. COVID-19 is having a devastating effect on regional, domestic and international travel, and we want to make sure that our aviation industry is protected. Thank you for the question.
The member for Goldstein.
Thank you, Speaker. Speaker, my question is to the Minister for Health. Will the Minister update for the House the Morrison government's health response to the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to really thank the member for Goldstein for his question, but also for the initiative which he, along with other members in this chamber on both sides, have taken to support local communities by encouraging community groups and assisting them as they support older Australians or isolated Australians. I think it's been an immensely human and important move, and it's been one that people on all sides are pioneering and practising in their own electorates. The central approach within our health response, as I mentioned earlier, is twofold. One is to reduce the rate of infection or to help contain the virus, and then secondly to increase the capacity. In terms of reducing the rate of infection, there are four core elements. One there is what we are doing with regards to the ring of steel around our borders. That is well known. Two is our testing regime, which is at the global forefront. Earlier today, the figures provided by the National Incidence Centre were 313,000 tests so far and a positive rate of just under 2%. What that actually means is that we are testing widely and broadly, and that we are getting a representative outcome from our testing. It allows us then to go to the third element, which is the tracing, the contact tracing, and finding all of those who have been in contact and therefore are most at risk. This is about ensuring that the thing which the Prime Minister and Professor Murphy talked about yesterday, of reducing cases in the community, of reducing these community transmission cases and finding them and mopping those up, is given the best chance forward. And the more we can do that, the further we can reduce the rate of infection. And then, of course, perhaps most importantly of all, is the social distancing and self-isolation which Australians have been practising magnificently. We have all sadly seen in our own electorates what that has meant in terms of normal engagement and what it has meant with regards to the way we've been able to go about our lives. But what is so contrary to our nature is so fundamental to our future. So those actions which Australians are undertaking and which I know they will continue to undertake over Easter are saving lives and protecting lives. Each one of us can save a life by isolating and maintaining our distance. At the same time, we've been boosting our capacity, as I mentioned earlier. One particular feature, which is immensely important, is bringing universal telehealth online. 2.5 million services already. We have transformed the way medical primary health has been and is being delivered in Australia. That's protecting our doctors and our nurses, it's protecting our patients, and all of these elements are coming together as we flatten that curve, as we increase our capacity, and as we work together to save lives and protect lives.
The member for McMahon.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Prime Minister, private health insurers will save up to $5.5 billion from the deferral of non-urgent services over the next 6 months. Those savings far outweigh the small amount that's been returned to policyholders via the 6-month premium freeze. What's the government doing to ensure that those savings are returned to Australians doing it tough and not pocketed by the insurers?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'll ask the Minister for Health to add further to this question. And you rightly note that policyholders have had the benefit of a reprieve there from those companies. I think it's very important as we continue to work through these many issues that wherever possible we try not to look at these issues as a contest or a conflict between interests here, and that we are trying to encourage others to come to the table in good faith and not to second-guess their motives wherever possible. I mean, that will be subject to the normal tests that I think will exist in the public space. But it has not been apparent to me that the private health insurance companies have engaged in bad faith in this process, and nor would I expect them to do so. And if they were to do so, then the government would obviously take steps to ensure that that was remedied. But with that introduction, I'm happy for the Minister for Health to add further.
The Minister for Health.
Thanks very much to the Speaker and to the Prime Minister and to the member for McMahon. One of the things that we've been very focused on is ensuring that we are working with the private health insurers as well as the private hospitals. The private hospitals I've already had the opportunity to address during question time. I have spoken at length with the leaders of both the large and small private health insurer organisations, both the Members Health for the small and the Private Health Australia for the large, as well as with many leaders within the particular sector. They have responded, and I know they've also spoken with the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister's office has provided a very clear and strong message that they expect the private health insurers to step up, but they have already taken steps. I've not heard that figure, and I would want to respectfully check that figure which you have, which the member has set out. I do know that after the discussions they chose a very significant measure of waiving the increases. I do know that individual insurers are making very significant provisions for hardship and supporting individuals. And in addition to that, one of the things we are always looking to do is to make sure that we have not just a sustainable public health system but a sustainable private health system. We are expecting a very significant surge in elective surgery after the virus has passed, and so there will be ebbs and flows. We'll seek further advice on those figures that you raised, and if the member has that detail, I'd be interested to receive that. But I would say this, that all of the insurers that I spoke with were, above all else, focused on provision of support for those Australians who have that need and to ensure that hardship packages, additional support were addressed during the course of the coronavirus period.
And I call the member for Wentworth.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, my question is to the Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting Australians through the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for the National Disability Insurance Scheme and Minister for Government Services.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Can I thank the member for Wentworth for his question and for the hard work he's doing in his community to support Australians in a very difficult time. And can I thank all members who are in their own ways seeking out to serve their individual constituents. It's extraordinarily heartening to see the whole House operating like that. The Morrison government is quite rightly supercharging our safety net in these extraordinarily difficult times. The new time-limited coronavirus supplement being paid at $550 a fortnight is a great example. It means anyone eligible for the maximum job seeker payment will now receive more than $1,100 a fortnight, effectively doubling the job seeker payment for the next 6 months. They'll receive that on top of their current payment each fortnight, flowing from April the 27th. In addition to effectively doubling job seeker through the introduction of this supplement, we're also expanding eligibility. We're waiving elements of means testing, including the liquid asset waiting period, the ordinary waiting period, waiving the assets mean testing, and also adjusting the taper rate for partnered access, so people can gain access to job seeker even though their partner earns upwards towards $80,000 per annum. The intent is to assist Australians who ordinarily wouldn't have eligibility to access these payments. Last night we completed the vast bulk, over 90% of the $4.5 billion in $750 payments through to 6 million Australians 10 days ahead of schedule. The further $750 will be paid in July. On Friday last week, I announced a pause on all social services debt raising and recovery, again to assist Australians. All those workers within Services Australia have now been redeployed to processing and call centre activities. Likewise, on the 21st of March, the Disability Reform Council for the NDIS announced over $1.1 billion worth of measures to assist the sector. 470 providers have taken up the option to get 1 month's advance payment on their provider or supplier costs to $587 million, and a 10% loading has been added to core supports at $512 million. Likewise, plans have been able to be extended by up to or for 24 months, and we're currently in the process of calling over 40,000 vulnerable Australians with NDIS plans to ensure their safety, well-being and ongoing management. And tomorrow, the Australian Health Protection Principal Committee Advisory Group will seek to deliver a response plan focusing on the unique health needs of people with disability to implement immediately following the Disability Advisory Group being added to that. So I want to assure all Australians the Morrison government is absolutely committed to supporting them in what is a very difficult time for the country.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. And my question is addressed to the Prime Minister. And I refer him to the fact that Australians relied on the ABC to give them emergency updates during the bushfire crisis. Now Australians are relying upon the ABC to keep them informed, stay safe and to support the ongoing education of their children during this health crisis. Will the Prime Minister restore funding so the ABC can keep doing its job so effectively?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The ABC is doing an excellent job and they'll continue doing that job with the resources that have been provided to them, Mr Speaker. Like all agencies, like all Australians, they will all do the best job they can with the resources they have available to them.
The member for Barara.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education. Will the Minister update the House on how the Morrison government is supporting families with the costs of childcare as we confront the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Education has the call.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for his question and for the passion that he brings to education in this country. It's a heartfelt passion. He wants to see every child get the very best education they possibly can, and it's a pleasure to work with him. Mr Speaker, we're backing free early childhood education and care for around 1 million families, no matter what type of service they use. Under the plan, the government will pay 50% of the sector's fee revenue up to the existing hourly rate cap as of 2 March, before enrolments dropped due to coronavirus. We require services not to charge families fees. The new system started from 6 April and will be reviewed after 1 month, with an extension to be considered after 3 months. So we're looking at 6 months of free childhood education and care for 1 million families. The plan complements more than $1 billion we expect the sector to receive through our new JobKeeper payment to help ensure many of the 200,000 vital education workforce can stay connected to services. It means all families can access free childcare, and it is a lifeline for the country's 13,000 early childhood education and care services. The plan means the sector is expected to receive $1.6 billion over the coming 3 months from taxpayer subsidies because of the March 2 baseline that has been set, compared to an estimated $1.3 billion if current revenues and subsidies had continued, based on the existing system that has a significant reduction of enrolments the sector was seeing as a result of the coronavirus. We're asking 3 things of the sector. They prioritise children of essential workers, and as the Prime Minister has said, every worker is an essential worker, whether it be the doctors and the nurses in our health workforce, whether it be the people repairing the tyres for the trucks that are delivering the goods to the supermarkets, whether it be those who are working in our agricultural sector, whether it be those who are working in our cities to deliver services. They are all essential workers. We also want them to prioritise vulnerable children. As the member for Farrer was saying, we need to ensure that our children remain safe during this next 6 months in particular. So we want to make sure that those vulnerable children are prioritised, and also that they prioritise those families who have an existing relationship with their provider. What we were seeing with families were unenrolling their children from their providers. We want to make sure that they re-engage with their provider. So especially once we get through this 6 months, that our child sector will be ready to be up and running to help us get our economy rebuilding after this pandemic.
The member for Barton has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Could the Prime Minister outline his plans to guarantee food security to First Nations communities during the coronavirus crisis, especially in remote communities in the Northern Territory, Western Australia and Northern Queensland?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question. As I indicated before, there's some $123 million of support which is going in to support Indigenous communities. One of the very pleasing elements of the payments that the Minister for Government Services has outlined is that when those payments have come through in Indigenous communities, there has been a very large purchase of food in those communities. And that is fantastic. We were so pleased, and I want to thank everyone who was involved, including the member for Barton, for the messaging that was going into Indigenous communities about how those payments might be used in those circumstances. And this was a tremendous result. Obviously, in the town stores, as a result of that, that has led to some supply shortages going into those communities. And I know the Minister for Indigenous Affairs is working directly with the Executive Chair of the COVID Commission, Neville Power, to ensure that those supply lines of those food stocks going back into those communities is being refreshed as we speak. That is one of the key tasks of the Coordination Commission. They're a group of very successful, very practical, problem-solving people from the private sector who are able to work through logistics issues, food supply chain issues, working out of the Ministry of Department of Home Affairs, Paul Grigson, who's the Deputy Secretary there. He's also leading a team that is also working on the supply chain issues, getting not just supplies of food to remote Indigenous communities, but also rural communities, regional communities. So we're not just restocking, supplying our shopping centres and supermarkets in the cities, but right across the country. Another key issue they're working on at the moment is that they're not just supplying the big supermarkets in the big shopping centres, but in the corner stores as well. When we want people to stay home and only go out for what they need, we don't want them to have to go too far. Now, in remote Indigenous communities, they have no choice because many of these communities, rightly, and I want to commend the Chief Minister Gunner for the great job he's doing in the Northern Territory in securing these communities. But getting food to them is an important task, and I can assure the Minister, the member I should say, that the COVID Commission, working together with the Minister for Indigenous Affairs, is making sure with the Chief Ministers and Premiers in those states that these supply lines are being replenished and that support will be in place for those communities. Of all the issues we discuss at the National Cabinet, I want to assure the Shadow Minister for Indigenous Australians that our biggest concern of all the vulnerable communities in Australia is for Indigenous communities. Recently I spoke with Prime Minister Trudeau, and it's a similar issue in Canada and the remote Indigenous communities in Canada, and we had a very good discussion about, and we are employing very similar measures to both protect, insulate, but also maintain supply of supports to those communities, not just food, but essential services as well, whether it be education or health or indeed protection for people in those communities from violence. So I thank the member for her question. I know the Minister for Indigenous Australians will be happy to keep her updated on that matter on a regular basis.
The member for Mackellar.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment. Will the Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is supporting Australia's tourism and trade sectors through the coronavirus pandemic?
The Minister for Education, representing the Minister for Trade, Tourism and Investment.
Thanks, Mr Speaker, and can I thank the member for Mackellar for his question. And while we're here in question time, I received a text message, the Coronavirus Australian Gov message, which said, "Stay home this Easter and help save lives. Only leave for what you really need: exercise, work, medical and care," at oz.gov.au. Now, that is an incredibly important message for all Australians to abide by. But what it means for our domestic tourism industry is that what would be a normal Easter won't be a normal Easter for them anymore. It won't be a normal Easter for also those who rely on international tourism. They have seen their market absolutely devastated by this coronavirus. And that is why the government has put in place JobKeeper and JobSeeker to provide a ballast for those who operate in the tourism industry. Because I don't think there is any sector across this nation that has been harder hit than that tourism industry. And particularly when it comes to domestic tourism, that is what underpins so many of the hotels, the motels, the restaurants, the cafes right across our great nation. When it comes to those who are operating in our trade sector, we are also providing assistance. Last week the government announced a new $110 million initiative to back Australia's agriculture and fisheries sector by helping them move their high-quality produce into key markets with return flights, bringing back vital medical supplies, medicines and equipment. A very smart initiative, a win-win when it comes to getting our goods overseas, when it comes to bringing much-needed medical supplies back. This initiative utilised the freight capacity of Qantas and Virgin aircraft, maintaining 4 key routes through aviation hubs, including London, Los Angeles, Hong Kong and Auckland. There is also the $49.8 million for the export market development grants this financial year, supplementing the $60 million already committed and bringing EMDG funding to its highest level in more than 20 years at $207.7 million. This allows exporters and tourism business to get additional reimbursements for costs incurred in marketing their products and services around the world. It will benefit over 200 businesses in the tourism sector alone. Mr Speaker, we want to make sure as best we can our trade and tourism industries not only survive this pandemic but come out the other side even stronger. We're committed to do everything we can to help achieve that, and we will continue working every single minute of every single day to achieve that while this pandemic continues to impact our communities.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper and simply remind Australians once again, this Easter, don't go away, stay home, only go out for what you need, and that way we can continue to lock in the gains that you have achieved for this country. Thank you.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Very short indulgence. I join with the Prime Minister with that message, and I'm sure we can have a happy and, for those people of faith, a holy Easter with the Easter Bunny still coming on Sunday.